And our question this time concerns the subject of the Sabbath day and talking about that day of rest. We had a question basically asking about whether or not Sunday is a day of rest now, just like the Sabbath was. Well, really you're talking about two different things when you talk about the Sabbath day versus the first day of the week, or as on our calendar is Sunday. There are two different days involved in that, and what we find is as we study the Bible, we're going to see that the day of rest of the Old Testament was the Sabbath day, and that's far different from the first day of the week. So if you look here in the book of Exodus with me, in the book of Exodus in chapter 20, you're going to read where the Bible says, where God's speaking at this time in verse 8 of Exodus 20, says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it," he said, "thou shalt not do any work, neither thy son nor thy daughter, thy manservant, thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is in the gates. For in 6 days God made heaven and earth and the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Where also he said, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Now, in Old Testament times, we see where God said there was a Sabbath day, and that Sabbath day, or that day of rest, was the seventh day. The word Sabbath itself means seventh. Sabbath doesn't mean rest. Sabbath means seventh. And so here is the seventh day of the week. That was a day of rest. What's interesting is you'll see this Sabbath day discussed, and other Sabbath days, really, those days that were there discussed at other times. Finally, there was a Sabbath year, in fact, there that was discussed also. And so we find these various times, this seventh, or this time of rest in the Old Testament. He said the reason behind it was, just as God worked 6 days and then rested the seventh, he said, I want you to work 6 days and then I want you to rest the seventh. This is what God set up for this nation of people. This nation, the Jewish people. That's what's under consideration. Now, somebody says, well, what about the first day of the week then? Isn't that a day of rest too? Or isn't that our time of rest? Sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Christian Sabbath. You heard that, I'm sure. The Christian Sabbath. There's no such thing, though. When you look into the New Testament, you see no such description of the day like that. Now, yes, the first day of the week is a day of worship. We see that from Acts chapter 2, when on the day of Pentecost, the first day of the week, folks there, the Christians, about 3,000 that first day in Acts 2:42, were worshiping God through the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and in prayer. All those things they did. Acts 2:42. We see it again in Acts 20 and verse 7 when it says the disciples came together there at Troas, but they came together on the first day of the week. It says to break bread, and Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow. Continued his speech till midnight. When they came together, there was a time for worship through preaching, through the Lord's Supper. And when we understand what's involved in the Lord's Supper, we also see prayers involved in that. So you had the preaching, you had the prayers, you had the Lord's Supper. First day of the week being what it is, it would also have been a day for giving, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. And of course singing praises to God, Colossians 3:16. All those things being done, that's what is described as that time of worship on the first day of the week in the New Testament. But it's not described as a day of rest. The day of rest was the Sabbath day. There in the Old Testament, it was that Sabbath day, the seventh day of the week, in which the people, except the priest of course, the people would have rested on that day. Otherwise, you come to the first day of the week, you don't read about that at all. That was not there, it's not discussed, it's not taught, it's not commanded, there's no example of it in the New Testament, no anything like that. But a day of worship, time of worship is there. And so we need to respect that. So we need to respect the difference between the Sabbath day of the Old Testament and the first day of the week of the New, because the New Testament is the covenant under which we live today.